The world was made of mud and wind. Here in the high plains of Wyoming Territory, spring did not arrive with grace. It clawed its way out from under winter's grip, leaving a raw, wounded landscape in its wake. Patches of dirty snow clung to the north-facing slopes of the hills like old bandages, weeping meltwater into the earth until the ground itself was a thick, greedy mire. The ruts of the wagon trail were 2 deep trenches of it, threatening to swallow the wheels of the stagecoach with every turn. The wind was a constant thief, stealing the warmth from a man's coat and the hope from his heart. It howled a lonely song through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods huddled along the creek beds. Their new buds still clenched tight against the cold. Everything felt unfinished, exposed. Inside the rocking, groaning coach, Clara felt as raw as the land. She sat alone on the worn leather bench, a small, forgotten parcel in the vast, empty country. Her hands were in her lap, palms up. The skin was torn, the knuckles scraped bloody and swollen, with tiny splinters of wood embedded in the flesh. She had done that to the window frame of a hotel room in Cheyenne 2 nights ago, clawing at it, trying to pry it open, to find some way out before the man who had bought her came to the door. She had fled, leaving behind the small trunk that held everything she owned, and scrambled onto the first westbound stage with the last of the money her mother had secretly pressed into her hand. Now she was heading toward a place called Dry Rock, a name that felt like a cruel joke in this world of sucking mud. The rhythmic lurch and sway of the coach was a constant torture, jarring the bruises that painted her ribs and arms. But it was better than stillness. Stillness brought memory. Yet, memory came anyway, unbidden. Like the relentless wind, it took her back to the parlor in Pennsylvania, a room that always smelled of lemon polish and regret. Her father stood before the hearth, his back ramrod straight, his voice the very sound of pragmatism. He was not a cruel man, not in the way some were, but he was a man cornered by failure, a failed business, a failed farm, a failed promise of a comfortable life. He held a photograph in his hand. "His name is Mr. Abernathy," he had said, not looking at her, but at a point on the wall just over her head. "He is a man of means. He has a stake in a silver mine in Colorado and a mercantile in this town, Dry Rock. He requires a wife." Clara had remained silent. Her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her fingernails left crescent moons in her palms. It was the same silence she had learned as a child, the silence that was mistaken for obedience. Her mother sat in her armchair by the window, her needlework untouched, her gaze fixed on the dreary street outside. She was a ghost at this negotiation for her daughter's future. "He has been generous," her father continued, the word catching in his throat like a fishbone. "He has paid off our debts. He has sent funds for your passage. It is a good match. Clara, you will be provided for. You will want for nothing." He finally held out the photograph. The man in it was thick-set, with a fleshy face and small, deep-set eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. A heavy watch chain was draped across his burgeoning waistcoat. There was a smugness in his posture, the look of a man accustomed to buying whatever he wanted. He was twice her age, perhaps more. This was the man who required a wife, not a woman. Not a partner, a wife, an item to be acquired, a household to be managed, a body to be used. Her mother had finally spoken, her voice a rustle of dry leaves. "He sent a letter. He said he values a woman of good breeding and quiet temperament." It was meant as a comfort, Clara knew, but it felt like instructions for a piece of livestock. Behave, be quiet, be valuable. She had been packed and put on a train like a piece of freight. The photograph and the name, her only bill of lading. The journey west was a blur of clattering wheels and changing landscapes, each mile taking her further from the only world she knew and deeper into a terrifying unknown. Every man who looked at her felt like a threat, every friendly word a deception. She had been sold, and in the selling, she had become nothing more than an object. She had learned what that meant in Cheyenne. Mr. Abernathy had met her train. He had not looked at her face, but had instead surveyed her body, up and down, a slow, appraising gaze that made her skin crawl. He had taken her to the finest hotel, and in the room, his intentions had become brutally clear. He had not waited for a preacher, for a vow. He had paid for her, and he had come to collect. That was when she had fought, when she had clawed at the window, when she had finally, blessedly, escaped into the night. A sudden, violent jolt of the coach threw her from her seat, slamming her against the opposite wall and pulling her from the mire of the past into a new and immediate terror. The coach was not just stuck, it had been stopped. A man's shout, sharp with alarm, was cut short by a grunt of pain and then silence. The driver. Clara's heart hammered against her bruised ribs. She scrambled to the window, peering out. 2 riders had pulled alongside, their face covered with dirty bandanas. A third was on the ground, holding the reins of the lead horses. The driver was slumped over in his seat, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. One of the men dismounted and wrenched open the coach door. "Well now, look what we got here," he rasped, his eyes crinkling above the faded blue cloth. They were small and mean, like a pig's. Just like old Abernathy said, one pretty little package, all ready for delivery. So, it wasn't a random robbery. They had been waiting for her. Abernathy had sent them. Perhaps he thought to teach her a lesson. Perhaps this was his idea of claiming his property. The thought sent a jolt of ice and fire through her veins. She would not be his property. She would not be anyone's. As the man reached for her, she reacted without thinking. She kicked out, her worn boot connecting with his chest. He stumbled back, cursing, surprised by her fight. It was all the chance she needed. She scrambled out the other side of the coach, her feet sinking into the cold, thick mud. She ran. She did not know where, only away. The mud pulled at her skirts, heavy as lead, sucking at her shoes. Each step was a battle. The cold air burned in her lungs. She could hear them laughing behind her, the sound casual and cruel. They were enjoying this. It was a game to them, a hunt. A rope snaked through the air, the loop settling over her shoulders, pinning her arms to her sides. She was jerked backward, falling hard into the muck, the air forced from her lungs in a pained gasp. She lay there, mud seeping into her hair, into her clothes, as one of them ambled over, coiling the rope. "Got some fire in you, don't you?" he chuckled, hauling her to her feet. "Abernathy might pay extra for that, or maybe we'll just have a little fun first, a reward for our trouble." He grabbed the front of her dress, the cheap fabric tearing with a sound like a scream. The laces of her corset snapped, the sudden release of pressure making her gasp. The cold air hit her skin. Despair, cold and absolute, began to settle over her. She had run, and she had fought, and it had not been enough. There was no escape. That was when the shot rang out. It was a single, sharp crack that echoed off the hills, clean and final. The man holding her stiffened, a look of profound surprise on his face. A small, dark hole appeared in his shoulder, and he crumpled to the ground, howling and clutching at the wound. Clara spun around, her eyes wide with shock. A lone rider sat on a tall buckskin horse about 50 yards down the trail. He was just a silhouette against the gray sky. A man and a horse, as still and silent as the land itself. He had not shouted a warning. He had simply acted. The other 2 highwaymen stared, momentarily frozen. Then, as the rider nudged his horse forward at a slow, deliberate walk, they broke. Panic seized them. One scrambled onto his partner's horse, and they dug their heels in, sending the animal galloping wildly back the way they had come, mud flying from its hooves. They did not spare a glance for their wounded companion, who was now trying to crawl away through the mud, leaving a smear of blood behind him. The rider stopped his horse beside the stagecoach. He dismounted, his movements economical and unhurried. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denims and a heavy sheepskin coat, the collar turned up against the wind. A dark, sweat-stained hat was pulled low over his eyes. He paid no mind to the whimpering man on the ground, his gaze settling on Clara. She stood there, trembling, mud-caked and disheveled, the torn front of her dress gaping open. She instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, a useless gesture of modesty. She expected a look, a leer, the same appraising glance she had gotten from every other man. But his eyes, when they met hers, were different. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky. And they held no judgment, no avarice. They simply saw. They saw her, a woman in trouble, and nothing more. He had a scar, a thin white line that cut through his left eyebrow and disappeared into his hairline, giving him a perpetually serious expression. He looked away from her, toward the wounded man. "Get on your horse and ride," he said. His voice was low and quiet, with a rough edge to it, like stones rubbing together. It was not a shout, but it carried an authority that was absolute. The man, clutching his shoulder, stared up at him with wide, fearful eyes. "You shot me!" "And I won't miss the next one. Go!" The man scrambled to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle with a groan of pain, and galloped away. Hunched over and bleeding, the silence that fell was profound, broken only by the keening of the wind and the soft snort of the buckskin horse. The cowboy. Eli walked over to the stagecoach driver. He checked for a pulse, his movements gentle, then straightened up and shook his head slowly. The world seemed to shrink around Clara, the silence pressing in. Eli turned back to her. He did not step closer, maintaining a respectful distance. He took in her shivering, her torn dress, the mud that clung to her like a second skin. He seemed to be weighing his options, his gaze thoughtful. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat. He walked toward her, and for a terrifying second, she flinched, expecting a rough hand, a cruel touch. But he stopped a few feet away and simply held the coat out to her. She stared at it, then at him. He waited, patient, slowly, hesitantly. She reached out and took it. The sheepskin was heavy, worn smooth on the inside and warm from his body. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the clean scent of the cold plains. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the warmth a shocking comfort against her chilled skin. It was huge on her, the sleeves hanging down past her hands, the hem brushing her ankles. She felt swallowed by it, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of something like safety. "My cabin ain't far," he said quietly, his gaze directed at the horizon. "There's a fire. You can get warm." She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He walked to his horse, untied a bedroll and a sack of supplies, and tossed them into the back of the stagecoach. Then he came back and, with a strength that was gentle and sure, lifted the driver's body and carefully laid him inside as well. He closed the doors. He did not seem like a man accustomed to speaking of what needed doing. He simply did it. He led his horse over to her. "Can you ride?" She nodded again, though her whole body ached. He cupped his hands for her foot, and she placed her muddy shoe in them, allowing him to help her up onto the broad, steady back of the buckskin. He put the reins in her hands, then went to the front of the stagecoach, unhitched the two lead horses, and tied them to the back of his own saddle. He swung himself up behind her, his presence a solid warmth at her back. He did not touch her, save for his hands reaching around her to take the reins. The space between their bodies was a chasm of unspoken questions and fears, but the circle of his arms was a strange, protective cage. He nudged the horse forward, leading the small procession away from the abandoned coach, away from the ruts in the trail, and into the untracked wilderness. The world began to blur at the edges. The exhaustion, the cold, and the shock were finally taking their toll. Her head grew heavy, and she leaned forward, her cheek resting against the coarse mane of the horse. The last thing she remembered was the steady rhythm of the horse's walk and the faint, clean scent of wood smoke on the coat that enveloped her. She awoke to darkness and warmth. For a moment, she did not know where she was. She was lying on something soft, a straw-tick mattress, by the feel of it, and covered with a thick wool blanket. A fire crackled in a stone hearth across the room, casting flickering orange shadows on the rough log walls. The cabin was small, just one room, meticulously clean and sparse. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A dry sink was against one wall, and shelves holding a few tins of food, a handful of books, and a second, unused coffee cup were next to it. Her rescuer was sitting on the floor by the fire, his back to her, methodically cleaning his rifle. He had not lit a lamp. He seemed a man comfortable in the shadows. Clara slowly sat up, the wool blanket pooling around her waist. She looked down at herself. Someone had cleaned the mud from her face and hands. The torn dress was gone. She was wearing a man's long-sleeved undershirt, the soft, worn flannel impossibly large on her, the sleeves rolled up multiple times. A wave of panic seized her. Had he, as if sensing her movement, her fear? He spoke without turning around. "Your dress was wet and torn. I left it on the hearth to dry. Didn't seem right to leave you in a cold corset." His voice was a low rumble. Matter of fact. He kept his eyes on his work. He had undressed her, but it had been a practical act, not a violation. He had covered her and left her alone. She watched him, the careful, precise movements of his hands as he oiled the rifle's mechanism. He was a man of immense and terrifying capability. He had killed one man, or close to it, and chased off 2 others without a second thought. Yet, he had treated her with a gentleness she had never known from any man. The contrast was a dizzying puzzle. She lay back down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. But sleep would not come. She was too aware of him, a silent guardian in the dim, firelit room. She must have drifted off eventually, because her next awareness was of thrashing against an unseen enemy, a choked cry escaping her lips. She was back in the hotel room, Abernathy's fleshy hands grabbing at her, his whiskey-sour breath hot on her face. A hand touched her shoulder, and she flinched violently, scrambling away until her back hit the cold log wall, her eyes wide with terror in the darkness. "Easy now," a quiet voice said. Eli was kneeling by the cot, his hand held up in a gesture of peace. The fire had burned down to embers, but she could see the concern in his pale eyes. "You were dreaming. You're safe here." She stared at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the phantom feeling of rough hands still on her skin. He did not move closer. He simply knelt there, waiting for the terror to pass. When her breathing finally steadied, he stood up. "I'll be by the fire," he said, and retreated, leaving her in the sanctuary of the shadows. He did not lie on the cot again. He spread his bedroll on the floor by the hearth, placing himself between her and the door. Clara watched him settle down, a dark shape against the dying glow of the embers. He laid his rifle on the floor beside him, within easy reach. He was her protector, her captor, her savior. He was a complete stranger, and she was entirely at his mercy. And yet, for the first time since leaving Pennsylvania, she felt the tight knot of fear in her stomach begin to loosen. Just a fraction. The next morning, she awoke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Sunlight streamed through the single, clean window. Eli was standing at the hearth, his back to her once more, tending to a skillet. He had already been outside, his boots were muddy, and there was a stack of fresh firewood next to the hearth. She sat up, her body a symphony of aches. The shirt she wore slipped off one shoulder. She pulled it back up, feeling a flush of vulnerability. He seemed to have an uncanny awareness of her, for he spoke without turning. "There's coffee on the fire, and a basin of water on the sink if you want to wash up." She slid her legs out of the cot. Her own shoes and stockings, now clean, were set neatly beside it. She padded silently over to the dry sink, The water in the basin was still warm. As she washed her face, she caught her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging on the wall. A stranger stared back at her, a pale, bruised girl with haunted eyes and tangled hair. She turned and looked at him. He was still tending the food, a quiet, solitary man in a quiet, solitary cabin. He had saved her life. He had brought her to his home. He had cleaned her wounds, given her his clothes, and slept on the floor to make her feel safe. He had not asked for her name. He had not asked what happened. He had not asked for anything. He had simply given her shelter, warmth, and a respect so profound it felt like a foreign language. Her voice, when she finally used it, was a dry, rusty whisper. "You're not like other men." He stopped what he was doing, his shoulders going still. For a long moment, he did not move or speak. He just stood there, his back to her, the silence stretching between them, thick with the unspoken weight of the night that had passed. Then, slowly, he turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. He did not smile, and he did not reply. But she saw something shift in the depths of his pale blue eyes, a flicker of an old, deep hurt, and something else, something new and uncertain, like the first hint of a thaw on a frozen plain. The days that followed were a quiet, fragile truce with the world. Time in Eli's cabin was measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the slow crawl of sunlight across the plank floor, the rhythm of the fire being fed and banked, and the gradual easing of the ache in Clara's bones. She moved through the small space like a ghost, a skittish animal learning the boundaries of a new and uncertain territory. In the beginning, she did little more than lie on the cot, wrapped in the wool blanket, watching him. He was a man of deep, ingrained habits. He rose before the sun, moving with a silence that spoke of a lifetime of not wanting to be noticed. He would stir the fire, put the coffee on to boil, and then slip out into the cold. Gray dawn to tend to his horse and the 3 goats he kept in a small lean-to. When he returned, his face would be flushed from the cold, and he would set about making a simple breakfast of bacon or salt pork and skillet bread. He ate with a slow, deliberate focus, as if the food were a task to be completed. He never spoke unless it was necessary, and his questions were practical, never prying. "More coffee?" he might ask, his voice a low rasp. Or, "Is the blanket warm enough?" Clara remained wary, testing him in small, silent ways. She would deliberately leave the water basin on the table instead of the dry sink, to see if he would comment on the disorder. He would only move it back without a word. She would sit up suddenly when he walked past her cot, to see if his stride would falter. It never did. He moved with a quiet respect for her space, a physical deference that was utterly foreign to her. He never stood too close, never let his gaze linger on her. He afforded her a privacy that the one-room cabin should have made impossible. He was a wall of quiet strength, and she kept throwing herself against it, expecting it to crumble into the familiar violence or entitlement of other men. But it held firm. As her body began to heal, her awareness expanded beyond her own pain and fear. She began to truly see the cabin, to read the story of the man who lived within its walls. It was a place built for one, but haunted by the ghost of 2. There was the single cot where she slept, but on the mantelpiece sat 2 coffee cups, one nested inside the other. One was a plain tin cup, battered and stained. The other, tucked inside it, was made of finer ceramic, with a delicate, faded blue flower painted on its side. It was chipped, but it had clearly been treasured. Who had it belonged to? She saw the loneliness in the way his books, a worn Bible, a book of poetry by a man named Whitman, and a dry-looking volume on animal husbandry, were stacked so neatly on their shelf, their spines cracked from countless readings. She saw it in the chair he sat in by the fire at night, one of its legs carefully mended with rawhide strips, a patient, solitary repair. He was a man who fixed what was broken, who made do. who expected no help. He lived in a silence that was more than just an absence of sound. It was a fortress he had built around himself, brick by solitary brick. One afternoon, after she had been there nearly a week, he came in from chopping wood and saw her standing, unsteadily, by the cot. The bruises on her arms had faded to a sickly yellow-green, and the swelling in her hands had gone down. But she was weak, her legs trembling from disuse. "You should walk some," he said, his tone gentle, matter-of-fact. "Get the blood moving." She looked down at the large flannel shirt she wore. It fell almost to her knees. "I can't, in this." He nodded, accepting the simple truth of it. He went to a small wooden chest at the foot of his bedroll and opened it. He pulled out a pair of denim trousers, worn soft with age, and another flannel shirt, this one a faded red plaid. He laid them on the cot. Then he rummaged again and produced a pair of leather boots, smaller than the ones he wore but still impossibly large for her. "These might serve," he said, and then he turned and went back outside, giving her the privacy to change. She pulled on the clothes. They were his, and they smelled of him. That same scent of wood smoke and clean earth. The trousers were ridiculously big, and she had to roll them up several times at the ankles and cinch them tight with a piece of rope she found. The shirt swallowed her whole, but they were warm, and they were practical, and wearing them felt like putting on a suit of armor. She pushed her feet into the heavy boots, which clumped on the floor when she walked, dressed in his clothes. She felt both protected and utterly lost. She took her first steps outside, shuffling into the pale afternoon sunlight. The air was cold and clean, and the wind whipped her hair across her face. Eli was at the chopping block, splitting rounds of pine with an easy, powerful rhythm. He stopped when he saw her, resting the axe head on the block. He watched her take a few more clumsy steps, her body stiff and uncertain. He offered no help, no guiding hand, just a quiet, patient observation. He was letting her find her own feet, in her own time. And in that simple, profound act of restraint, he gave her more than any man ever had. He gave her a choice. Eli kept his distance, but her presence in his life was a constant, low-grade disturbance, like a stone in his shoe. For 10 years, this cabin, this small patch of land, had been his sanctuary from a world he did not trust. It was a world that had taught him its lessons early and harshly. He carried the memory of his father in the rigid set of his jaw and the constant tension in his shoulders. His father had been a man of loud, unpredictable rages, his heavy hands a constant threat that filled their small home with a humming, terrified silence. Eli had learned to be quiet, to be invisible, to anticipate the storms and hide from them. He learned that love and violence could live in the same house, in the same man, and that lesson had poisoned the well of his trust forever. His mother had been a whisper, a gentle, humming presence who tried to shield him with her own small body. He remembered the smell of lavender on her clothes and the sad, defeated look in her eyes. And then one day, she was just gone, disappeared. He was 8 years old. His father never spoke of her again, and the silence in the house grew deeper, colder, until it was all that was left. Eli grew up in that silence, nurturing a core of distrust so deep it was part of his bones. As soon as he was big enough, he had left, taking to ranch work, finding a strange comfort in the vast, empty spaces of the West, where the silence felt clean and natural, not choked with fear. He had learned to be alone, to rely on no one. He had even tried once, years ago, to let someone in, a woman in a town down south, with a quick laugh and warm eyes. But the silence and the distrust were too strong. He could not explain the darkness in him, the flinch that came whenever she raised her voice, the instinctive need to retreat. He had left her, too, before he could hurt her with the pieces of his own broken past. And now this woman, Clara, was here, filling his silence with her own. She was a constant, unsettling presence. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as she sat by the fire, her hands busy stitching the tear in her dress with the needle and thread he had given her. Sometimes, When she thought he was not paying attention, she would hum a quiet, sad little tune. The sound was so out of place in his cabin that it made the muscles in his back tense up. Other times, he would come inside to find her weeping silently, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. He never knew what to do in those moments. The boy in him wanted to run and hide. The man in him felt a fierce, protective ache in his chest. He would just stand there, helpless, until she composed herself, pretending he had seen nothing. He watched her study the fire for hours, her expression distant and haunted. What did she see in the flames? What memories was she burning away? He wanted to ask, but the questions always died in his throat. Questions were intrusions, and he would not intrude. He had rescued her from violence. He would not now inflict a different kind of injury, the prying kind that demanded she lay her wounds bare for his inspection. So he kept his distance and his silence, and wrestled with the strange, unfamiliar feeling of having another soul sharing his space. The storm came on the 5th night. It had been brewing all day, the sky a low, bruised purple, the wind growing teeth. By dusk, the first flakes of snow began to fall, not the gentle flakes of a proper winter, but a wet, heavy spring snow, driven sideways by a gale. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, rattling the door in its frame and finding every tiny crack in the chinking between the logs. Eli brought in extra firewood, stacking it high against the wall. He secured the door with a heavy wooden bar, shutting out the raging world. The cabin, which had felt sparse and lonely, now seemed impossibly small, a tiny, fragile ark in a sea of roaring darkness. The storm forced them together, shrinking the space between them until there was nowhere left to retreat. They ate their supper of stewed rabbit in near silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind. After, there was nothing to do but wait it out. Eli sat on his side of the hearth, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. Clara sat on hers, on a low stool, her hands idle in her lap. The air between them was thick with unspoken things. It was Clara who broke the silence, her voice barely audible above the storm. "It sounds like the world is ending." Eli looked up from his work. "It's just a spring squall. It'll blow itself out by morning." He paused, then added, "It can't get in here. The walls are thick." It was the closest he had ever come to offering a direct comfort. She stared into the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "Sometimes the walls don't matter. Sometimes the thing you're scared of is already inside." He stopped sharpening the knife, his hands going still. He knew what she meant. He had lived with that feeling his entire life. He chose his words carefully, the way a man crosses a frozen river, testing the ice with each step. A man I knew once said that trust is like a pane of glass. Once it's shattered, you can piece it back together, but it'll never be the same. You'll always see the cracks. Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, her gaze direct and searching. What if you were never given any glass to begin with? The question hung in the air between them, raw and honest. He didn't have an answer for that. He had only ever been given broken shards himself. He looked at her, at the shadows the firelight carved under her cheekbones, at the lingering fear in her eyes, and he saw a reflection of his own deep-seated distrust of the world. They were two sides of the same coin, both stamped with the mark of others' cruelty. "I suppose," he said slowly, his voice rough with emotion, "you have to find a way to make your own." They sat in silence for a long time after that, but it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer a wall between them, but a shared space, a small patch of common ground. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, something had settled. Finally, Clara asked the question that had been hovering just beneath the surface for days. "Why haven't you taken me to town, to Dry Rock?" Eli set his knife and whetstone down on the hearth. He looked at her directly, his pale eyes holding hers. "Because you haven't asked me to?" He let the words sink in. Then he murmured, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it over the wind. "I ain't keeping you." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was such a simple statement, but it held a universe of meaning. Every man in her life had been keeping her, in one way or another. Her father had kept her for his own financial salvation. Abernathy had tried to keep her as his property. Even the men on the trail had wanted to keep her for their own cruel amusement. But this man, this quiet, scarred cowboy, was not keeping her at all. He had given her food, shelter, and the clothes on her back, and he was asking for nothing in return. The choice was hers. It had always been hers, from the moment he had wrapped his coat around her. The realization was so overwhelming, so fundamentally world-altering, that it left her breathless. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of fear or despair. They were tears of a strange and painful gratitude. She quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand, embarrassed by the sudden show of emotion. Later, when the fire had burned low and the storm had begun to lose its fury, Eli spread his bedroll by the hearth as he had every night. He lay down with his back to her, a silent, unmoving guardian. But Clara could not sleep. Her mind was racing. "I ain't keeping you," the words echoed in her thoughts, a steady, powerful drumbeat. She sat up on the cot, the wool blanket falling away. The cabin was cold now, away from the fire's glow. She looked at his form, a dark shape on the floor. He had put a chasm of space between them every night, a gesture of respect she now understood completely. But tonight, the chasm felt like a lonely, desolate thing. She wanted to cross it. She stood up, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The flannel shirt he had given her was her only covering, the soft fabric whispering against her skin. She walked slowly, tentatively, toward the hearth, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She stopped just behind him, in the space between his bedroll and her cot. He was so still she thought he might be asleep. "Eli?" she whispered, the name feeling strange and new on her tongue. He did not move, but his voice came out of the near darkness, low and steady. "Yeah." "Can I?" she faltered, the words catching in her throat. She took a breath. "Can I sit closer to the fire? It's cold." He was silent for a long moment. Then he shifted, rolling onto his side to face her, making a space for her on the edge of his bedroll, on the warm stones of the hearth. He propped himself up on one elbow, his expression unreadable in the dim, red glow of the embers. He simply nodded. She sank down onto the floor, gathering the large shirt around her knees. Careful not to get too close, she held her hands out to the dying fire, feeling the last of its warmth on her skin. They sat like that for a long time, sharing the warmth, the silence, and the fading anger of the storm. Finally, she drew her hands back, her fingers brushing against his as she did. His hand was resting on the bedroll between them, calloused and strong. The touch was feather-light, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a spark of heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. He did not move his, but she saw his fingers curl slightly, his knuckles white in the gloom. The touch, as brief as it was, lingered in the space between them, a silent acknowledgement that something had irrevocably changed. The morning after the storm, the world was scrubbed clean and silent. The wind was gone, and a fragile sun shone on a landscape draped in a thin, melting blanket of white. Something inside Clara had settled. Too, the constant, thrumming fear that had been her companion for so long had receded, leaving behind a quiet ache, but also a space to breathe, a space to be. She began to fill that space, one small act at a time. She started not by asking, but by doing. One morning, as Eli headed out with his axe, she pulled on the heavy boots, her movements resolute, and followed him to the woodpile. He stopped, turning to her with a questioning look in his pale eyes. "I can do that," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since she arrived. "I'm not an invalid." He watched her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her determined expression, the way she stood squarely in his oversized boots. He seemed to have a debate with himself, a silent weighing of her fragility against her pride. Finally, he nodded slowly. He chose a smaller axe from a stump and handed it to her, handle first. He showed her how to place the wood, how to aim, how to let the weight of the axe do the work. He did not patronize her or rush her. He taught her with the same quiet patience he applied to everything. Her first few swings were clumsy, jarring her arms, but soon she found a rhythm. The sharp, satisfying thwack of the axe-splitting pine was the sound of her own strength returning. She took over the care of the 3 shaggy goats, milking them in the cold dawn. Her hands slowly growing accustomed to the work, she found a strange comfort in the simple, repetitive task, in the warm, musky smell of the animals, in the gift of the fresh, frothy milk. She insisted on cooking their meals, taking his meager supplies of flour, salt pork, and dried beans and transforming them into something more. She found a patch of wild onions by the creek and dug them up, adding a sharp, savory flavor to their stews. These were small reclamations, tiny territories of self-sufficiency, but to her, they felt as vast and significant as the plains themselves. She was no longer just a recipient of his care. She was a participant in their shared life. A new language began to grow between them, one spoken not in words, but in quiet gestures. It was a subtle, aching intimacy that bloomed in the space his silence afforded. One afternoon she returned from a walk to find a small clutch of early wildflowers, purple prairie crocus, pushing their way through the last of the snow, sitting in the ceramic cup on the table. He was nowhere to be seen, and he never mentioned them, but she knew. She left them there until their petals wilted and fell, a small, vibrant splash of color in the monochrome cabin. While he was out checking his trap lines, she would take a brush to the buckskin horse, working the tangles from his thick, pale mane. One day, her fingers, nimble from years of needlework, began to braid a small, intricate pattern into the strands behind his ear. It was a useless, beautiful thing. When Eli returned, he ran his hand over the horse's neck and his fingers stilled on the braid. He looked over at her where she stood by the cabin door. He said nothing, but a current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that left a flush of warmth on Clara's cheeks. He did not undo the braid. They moved around each other in the small cabin with an unconscious grace, a familiarity that belied the short time they had known each other. They learned the rhythm of each other's breathing, the sound of each other's footsteps. This growing closeness was a tender, fragile thing, and it terrified her as much as it comforted her. It felt too much like hope, and hope was a dangerous thing to entertain. The dam of her silence finally broke one evening as they sat by the fire. He was carving a piece of wood, his hands deft and sure, shavings falling to the floor. She was mending the sleeve of one of his shirts, the fabric worn thin as paper at the elbow. For days, the story of her husband had been a heavy, indigestible stone in her gut. She had to give it voice. She had to know if this fragile sanctuary would collapse under the weight of her truth. "His name is Abernathy," she said, her voice quiet, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. Eli's hands stopped their work, but he did not look up. He waited. "My father arranged it," she continued, each word a painful effort. "We were in debt, Mr. Abernathy is a wealthy man, a banker's son from back east. He came west to make his own fortune." She took a shaky breath, the needle frozen in her hand. "I was part of the price, for my family's security." She watched his face, but his expression was hidden by the brim of his hat and the flickering shadows. Only his knuckles, white as he gripped the piece of wood, betrayed any reaction. "He is not a good man," she whispered. "In Cheyenne, Before I ran, I learned things. The hotel clerk, she felt sorry for me. She told me, he has a reputation. Even there, a young woman, a servant at the house where he was staying last year. She was found badly hurt. She died a few days later. Everyone knew he did it. He had been seen with her. There were bruises on her before. But he has money. His father has money. He paid the girl's family. He paid the sheriff. And it all went away. She finished, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had laid the ugliest, most shameful part of her story at his feet. She expected him to recoil, to look at her with pity, or worse, with the detached disinterest of a man who has heard too many sad stories. Instead, he slowly lifted his head and looked at her. The change in his face was terrifying. The quiet patience was gone, erased. In its place was something cold and hard and utterly still. His pale eyes seemed to have frozen over, and the scar on his brow stood out, a stark white line against his suddenly taut skin. It was the face of a man looking at something he intended to destroy. For the first time, Clara saw the danger in him, the capacity for violence that she had witnessed on the trail. But it was not directed at her. It was a shield, held up in front of her. In that moment, seeing the cold fury in his eyes, she had never felt safer in her life. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. And then he deliberately picked up his knife and drove it into the piece of wood he was holding, splitting it in two with a sharp crack. He tossed the ruined pieces into the fire and watched them burn. A few days later, Clara found the courage to ask for what she needed. "I need to go to town, Eli, to Dry Rock." He looked up from the harness he was mending. "What for?" "I need to mail a letter to my mother to let her know I'm alive. And I need to buy some fabric. I cannot wear your clothes forever." He nodded. A simple, non-negotiable agreement. "We'll go in the morning." The ride to Dry Rock was tense. The settlement was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen false-fronted buildings, a mercantile, a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a handful of others huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty land. As they rode down the main street, Eli's buckskin drawing attention, Clara felt 100 eyes on her. Doors opened a crack. Faces appeared in windows. Women stopped sweeping their porches to stare, their gazes sharp and appraising. They saw a strange woman in ill-fitting men's clothes riding with Eli Cutter, a man known for his solitude and his silence. Their minds, hungry for scandal in a town starved of it, leaped to the most obvious and sordid conclusions. Clara could feel their judgment like a physical weight, a hot, prickling shame on her skin. She kept her eyes forward, her back straight, but she could feel herself shrinking inside. Eli seemed oblivious, his expression as impassive as ever, but she saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his gaze swept the street, missing nothing. He was a wall, and she was riding in his shadow. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and gossip. The proprietor, a portly man with a slick, knowing smile, greeted Eli with a nod and then let his eyes slide over to Clara, lingering far too long. "Eli," he said, his voice oily, "didn't figure you for the kind to take in strays." Eli's face remained a mask, but his voice was pure ice. "She needs fabric, Miller, and some thread." While Clara made her selections, her hands trembling as she felt the eyes of the other women in the store on her, Eli conducted his own business, trading several fine pelts for coffee, flour, and salt. When she brought her bolt of simple blue calico to the counter, Miller smirked. "Setting up a proper home now, are you, Eli?" Before Eli could answer, Clara met the man's gaze, her own eyes flashing with a sudden fire. "I am buying fabric to make a dress, sir. That is all." Her voice was clear and cold, and it cut through the thick air of speculation. Miller had the decency to look momentarily abashed. They left the town under the same cloud of staring, whispering judgment. The ride back to the cabin was silent, but the space between them was now filled with a new tension. They had been bruised by the outside world, and the shared wound bound them closer. The cabin, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like the only safe harbor in the world. That night, the dam broke. As she sat by the fire, the new fabric in her lap, the memory of those judging eyes, those whispered insinuations, overwhelmed her. They saw her as a fallen woman, a whore, Eli's property. They saw her as no different from the way Abernathy had seen her. A single, hot tear fell onto the blue fabric, followed by another, and another. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, a sound of such profound grief and despair that it seemed to shake the very logs of the cabin. Eli was across the room, but in an instant, he was kneeling in front of her. He did not speak. He simply reached out and took the fabric from her lap, setting it aside. Then, his calloused hands, so strong and capable, came up to cup her face. His thumbs gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. The touch was exquisitely gentle, a silent offering of comfort that was so unexpected, so tender, that it made her weep all the harder. He stayed there, kneeling before her, just holding her face, letting her cry until the storm of her grief had passed. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotion. She looked at him through her tear-blurred eyes, at his face so close to hers, at the deep, aching loneliness she saw in his expression. He was just as wounded by the world as she was. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to kiss her. A fierce, desperate longing rose in her, a desire to meet him, to feel that connection. But then, with a visible effort that seemed to cost him everything, he pulled back. He dropped his hands and stood up, retreating to the other side of the hearth, putting the fire and a world of distance between them once more. The rejection, gentle as it was a fresh wound. She watched him, his back now turned to her, his shoulders rigid. He was protecting her, she knew that, protecting her from himself, from the gossip, from her own vulnerable state. But it felt like he was pushing her away. She stood up, her legs trembling. She would not be pushed away. She would not be treated like a fragile, broken thing. She walked across the space between them, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, until she was standing directly behind him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He flinched at her touch, but he did not pull away. She moved around in front of him, forcing him to look at her. His face was a mask of turmoil, his pale eyes dark with a pain she recognized as his own. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. This had to be her choice, her decision. She reached up, tangled her fingers in the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled his face down to hers. She kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was clumsy and desperate, born of grief and gratitude and a deep, aching need to feel something other than fear. His lips were stiff at first, unresponsive, surprised. Then, with a low groan that seemed torn from the very depths of him, he kissed her back. His arms came around her, pulling her tight against him, and his mouth became demanding, hungry, as if he were a starving man and she were his first meal. The force of it, the sudden unleashing of his own pent-up loneliness, frightened and thrilled her. But then, just as suddenly as it began, he stopped. He broke the kiss, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, holding her at arm's length. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, his eyes shut tight as if in pain. "Don't," he rasped, his voice ragged. "Clara, we can't." He opened his eyes, and she saw a desperate plea in them. "You're hurt. You're not thinking clear. I don't want to be like them. I won't be another man who just takes." His words, meant to protect her, were like a slap. He was still seeing her as a victim. He was still making the choice for her. A new strength, forged in the fires of everything she had endured, rose up in her. Her eyes met his, clear and unwavering. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the force of her own conviction. "This is not about them," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "This is not about what was taken from me." She took a deep breath and laid her own soul bare. "I want it to be mine this time. The choice. I want this to be my choice." He stared at her, his eyes searching her face, seeing the truth, the strength, the absolute certainty in her expression. He saw that she was not a broken thing to be mended. She was a woman, whole and strong, making a decision. The turmoil in his face softened, replaced by a look of sheer, wondering reverence. Slowly, as if he were handling the most precious, fragile thing in the world, he lowered his head to hers again. This kiss was nothing like the first. It was slow and deep and exquisitely gentle. It was not a kiss of hunger, but of discovery. It was a question and an answer. It was a promise. And in the quiet of the small, solitary cabin, with the fire burning down to embers, it changed everything. That single reverent kiss was not an end, but a beginning. It was the careful, uncertain opening of a door that both had long believed to be permanently sealed. He led her not to his bedroll on the floor, but to the cot, the only proper bed in the cabin. He guided her as if she were made of spun glass, his touch hesitant, questioning, always giving her the space to pull away. But she did not pull away. What passed between them that night was a quiet, solemn ceremony of healing. It was slow and raw. A conversation held in the language of touch because words were too clumsy, too inadequate to carry the weight of their shared history of hurt. It was in the way his calloused hands that could break a horse or split a log, traced the faded bruises on her arms with a feather-light touch, as if trying to erase the memory of the blows that made them. It was in the way she laid her palm against the thin white scar on his brow, a silent acknowledgement of the pain he carried. This was not the frantic, selfish claiming she had feared, nor the passionate surrender she had read about in novels. It was a slow and patient exploration, a discovery of another soul in the darkness. For two people who had learned the hard lessons of survival by building walls around themselves. It was an act of terrifying bravery. It was the laying down of arms, and in the quiet darkness of the cabin, surrounded by the vast, indifferent silence of the plains, they found in each other a place of refuge, a small, warm space where they did not have to be alone. They slept in the narrow cot together, not in a tangle of limbs, but side by side, a profound and peaceful stillness between them, as if each were simply relieved to have a witness to their existence. The next day, a fragile sun rose on their new world. On the surface, nothing had changed. The morning chores still needed doing. Eli rose first, as always, moving with his ingrained quietness to stir the fire. Clara followed soon after, her movements stiff but her eyes clear. They returned to the familiar rhythm of their days as if by unspoken agreement. He went out to tend the horses, she went to milk the goats. They met back at the cabin for a breakfast of skillet bread and coffee. Yet everything had changed. The space between them, once a chasm of caution and silence, was now charged with a new current of awareness. Before, they had moved around each other with a careful, deliberate distance. Now, their bodies seemed to have a gravitational pull of their own. A light brush of fingers as he passed her the coffee pot. The way his hand lingered for a fraction of a second on the small of her back as he squeezed past her in the narrow space by the hearth. He looked at her more, his gaze no longer just observant, but filled with a quiet, wondering warmth. And for the first time, Clara found herself smiling. Small, secret smiles that were meant only for him. The silence was still there, but it was no longer an empty, lonely thing. It was full now, rich with everything that had passed between them, and everything that was yet to come. This delicate peace, as new and fragile as a spring bud, lasted for 3 days. On the 4th day, the outside world came for them. It arrived in the form of a circuit rider, a wiry man with a weathered face and restless eyes who made a living carrying mail and news between the territory's scattered and isolated homesteads. He rode up to the cabin in the late afternoon, and the moment Clara saw him, a cold dread snaked its way around her heart. Eli met the man outside, speaking to him in low tones. Clara watched from the doorway, her hands twisting in the fabric of her now finished blue calico dress. The rider handed Eli a single, official-looking envelope, then tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away, an omen of bad news disappearing over the horizon. Eli stood there for a long time, just looking at the envelope in his hand. Then he walked back to the cabin, his face as still and hard as carved stone. He held it out to her. It was not addressed to her, but to the sheriff of Dry Rock. But in the top corner, in a neat, arrogant script, was the return address: Jonathan Abernathy, Esquire. The rider said Abernathy himself gave it to him, Eli said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Paid him extra to make sure it was delivered to the sheriff, and to make a stop here, to let us know it was coming. It was a message, a warning. With trembling fingers, Clara took the letter. The seal was already broken. The rider had likely steamed it open, hungry for a bit of valuable information to trade. She pulled out the single sheet of paper. It was not a letter, but a legal document, filled with the cold, impersonal language of the law. It was a sworn affidavit, signed by her father, testifying to a marriage contract between his daughter, Clara May Taggart, and Mr. Jonathan Abernathy. It cited the funds Abernathy had paid, framing them as a dowry. It was followed by a warrant, signed by a judge in Cheyenne, for the return of a runaway wife, who was, by the laws of the territory, the legal property of her husband. A final, handwritten note was scrawled at the bottom: Sheriff, I will be arriving in Dry Rock in 5 days' time to collect what is mine. I expect your full cooperation. I will be accompanied by men who are prepared to assist you in your duties should this woman's captor prove unreasonable. The paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. The world tilted, the floorboards seeming to rush up at her. She stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping her lips. Her captor. The words were a brand, searing into her mind. That is what the world would see. A quiet cowboy who had stolen another man's property. No, she whispered, shaking her head, the single word a desperate prayer. No, no, no. She looked at Eli, her eyes wide with a returning, familiar terror. He was in danger. Because of her, they would come for him. They would call him a kidnapper, a thief. They would hang him. The fragile, beautiful world they had built in this cabin was about to be burned to the ground. I have to go, she said, her voice frantic. She looked around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. A trap. Eli, you have to let me go. I can run. I can hide. I'll go north, to the mountains. He will never find me. Eli's expression did not change. He reached down and picked up the letter, folding it neatly and placing it on the table. Then he looked at her, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet but unyielding, a bedrock of absolute resolve. No. But they'll kill you, she cried, tears streaming down her face. Don't you see? He has the law. He has money. He'll tell them you took me, that you forced me. They will believe him. You have to let me run. He stepped toward her, and for the first time, he took her by the arms, his grip firm, forcing her to be still, to look at him. Clara, he said, his pale eyes boring into hers. Listen to me. You shouldn't have to run again. Not from him, not from anyone. But what can you do? She sobbed, her hope crumbling. What can one man do against all that? I don't know, he admitted, his voice a low, rough whisper. But we ain't gonna find out by you running off into the wilderness alone. You're done running. The next morning, he rode for town. He wore his gun belt, the leather dark and well-oiled, the Colt revolver sitting heavy and comfortable on his hip. He looked like the man she had first seen on the trail, capable and dangerous. He said he was going to talk to the sheriff, to explain the situation, man to man. He believed, or wanted to believe, that the truth would be enough. Clara watched him ride away until he was just a small dot on the horizon, a terrible feeling of foreboding settling in her stomach like a cold stone. The sheriff in Dry Rock was a man named Beasley, a former ranch hand who had taken the job because it was easier than branding calves and came with a steady, if meager, salary. He was a man who understood the delicate ecosystem of a small western town. He knew that justice was a commodity, and that its scales were most often tipped by the weight of gold. He listened, his face impassive, as Eli laid out the story in his simple, direct way. He told him about the ambush, about Clara's bruises, about the story of the servant girl in Cheyenne. He spoke of the marriage contract as what it was, a bill of sale. When Eli was finished, Beasley leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in protest. He picked at his teeth with a sliver of wood. "That's a real sad story, Cutter," he said, his tone dismissive. "But what you're telling me is hearsay. What I got," he tapped the letter from Abernathy, which sat on his desk, "is a legal document, signed by a judge. Says the woman is his wife." "She ain't his wife," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "No preacher has said the words." "Don't matter," Beasley countered, shaking his head. "This here paper says she is, and Abernathy is a man of means. He's talking about investing in this town, building a new hotel. A man like that, well, a town like this needs men like that. We don't need trouble." "And the woman?" Eli asked, his voice tight. "What she wants don't matter at all?" Beasley sighed, a look of weary impatience on his face. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his dusty, insignificant town. "The law is the law, Eli. It says a wife is a man's property. Now, I don't like it any more than you do, but that's the way it is. When Mr. Abernathy gets here, I'm duty-bound to help him retrieve his property. If you stand in the way, that makes you a criminal. It's as simple as that." He turned from the window, his eyes hard. "My advice to you, when he comes, you give the girl up. It ain't your fight." Eli rode back to the cabin under a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The truth had not been enough. Money and power, just as Clara had said, spoke a language the law understood better than justice. He found the cabin empty. For a heart-stopping moment, a cold, absolute panic seized him. He thought she had run. Then he saw her, down at the lean-to. She was saddling his horse, the big buckskin, her movements frantic and clumsy. She had packed a small bundle, a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, the new calico dress, and tied it to the saddle horn. She was putting his life, his safety, before her own. She was trying to save him, the only way she knew how. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent in the soft earth. She did not hear him until he was right behind her. "What are you doing, Clara?" he asked, his voice quiet. She jumped, spinning around, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "I'm leaving. Eli, you can't stop me. It's the only way. If I'm gone, he has no reason to hurt you." "And where will you go?" he asked, his gaze steady. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "It doesn't matter, as long as it's away from here." He reached out and placed his hand over hers on the saddle leather. His touch was warm and firm. "It does matter," he said. "If you run now, he wins again. He wins because he made you afraid. He wins because he made you believe that running and hiding is all you're good for. And he wins because he takes you away from me." The last 4 words were spoken so softly. They were almost lost in the evening air, but they hit Clara with more force than a physical blow. He was not fighting for a principle. He was fighting for her, for them. She stared at him, her resolve crumbling. She had been so focused on his safety that she hadn't truly considered what she would be running from. Not just from Abernathy, but from this. From the quiet man who had shown her kindness, who had given her back her own strength, who was now willing to stand against the world for her. "But what can we do?" she whispered, her fight gone, replaced by a deep, weary despair. "I don't know," he said again, his honesty a strange kind of comfort. He gently took the reins from her hand and began to unsaddle the horse. "But we'll face him, together." That night, the small cabin felt like the only sane place in a world gone mad. The threat of Abernathy's arrival loomed over them, a dark cloud on the horizon. Clara could not be still. She paced the small floor, her arms wrapped around herself, the terror a living thing inside her. Eli watched her, his heart aching. Finally, he stood up and went to her, pulling her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against him, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She cried for her lost family, for her stolen future, for the servant girl in Cheyenne, and for the terrible injustice of a world where a woman's life was worth less than a man's signature on a piece of paper. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, letting her pour out all her fear and grief. He was her anchor in the storm, the one solid thing she could hold on to. When her tears finally subsided, she leaned back in his arms, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. She looked up at his face, at the worry and the fierce determination in his eyes. "You make me feel like I'm still worth fighting for," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He looked down at her, and a sad, gentle smile touched his lips. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "You always were," he said. The 5 days of waiting were a quiet, nerve-shredding agony. The air in the cabin grew thick with unspoken fear. With the tension of a drawn bowstring, they did not speak of what was coming. Instead, they focused on the small, immediate tasks of living. Clara baked bread until her knuckles were raw, needing the physical work to quiet the frantic beating of her heart. Eli cleaned his rifle and his revolver with a slow, methodical precision, each movement deliberate and final. They moved through their chores like ghosts, their new, fragile intimacy overshadowed by the looming threat. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and he would take her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, a silent promise that he would not leave her side. But in the dead of night, she would wake to find him staring into the darkness, his jaw set, his expression grim, and she knew he was preparing himself for a fight he might not win. The morning of the 5th day dawned cold and unnaturally still. There was no wind. The sky was a vast, empty bowl of pale gray. It felt like the world was holding its breath. Eli was outside, checking the horizon, when he saw the dust cloud. It was small at first, a faint smudge to the east, but it grew steadily, resolving itself into a small party of riders. He came back inside, his face calm, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "He's here!" Clara's blood ran cold. She went to the door and looked out. 4 men on horseback were approaching the cabin at a walking pace. 3 of them were rough-looking men, hired muscle by the set of their shoulders and the guns they wore low on their hips. The man in the lead, however, was different. He was dressed in a fine black coat and a bowler hat, looking ridiculously out of place in the rugged landscape. He was thick-set, with a fleshy, entitled face that she recognized instantly from the photograph. Mr. Abernathy. Even from a distance, she could feel the suffocating weight of his arrogance. Behind them, riding a little ways back, was Sheriff Beasley, his face a mask of reluctant duty. Eli stepped out onto the small porch, his stance relaxed but ready. He did not reach for his gun. He simply stood there, a quiet, immovable object. Clara stood just inside the doorway, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Abernathy reined in his horse a dozen yards from the cabin. He surveyed the scene, the humble log structure, the man standing before it, with a dismissive sneer. He did not look at Clara, did not even acknowledge her presence in the doorway. He addressed Eli as if he were a disobedient servant. "I am Jonathan Abernathy," he announced, his voice carrying the clipped, authoritative tone of the East. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I've come to collect my property. Eli's voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet.
She ain't property.
Abernathy chuckled, a short, unpleasant sound. The law says otherwise. Friend, I have a legal contract and a warrant, as the sheriff here can attest. He gestured with his chin toward Beasley, who shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Now, you can hand her over peacefully, and I will be on my way. Or, we can do this the hard way. It makes no difference to me. The outcome will be the same. The only way you're taking her, Eli said, his voice flat, is over my dead body. The three hired men shifted, their hands moving instinctively toward their pistols. Abernathy held up a placating hand, a smug smile playing on his lips. There's no need for that. This is a simple legal matter. Sheriff, you are sworn to uphold the law. I demand you retrieve my wife. Sheriff Beasley dismounted, his movements heavy. He looked at Eli, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. Cutter, don't make this difficult. I've got no choice in the matter. The law's on his side. The law is wrong, Eli stated simply. That may be, Beasley sighed. But it's still the law. Now step aside. It was then that Clara moved. She stepped out of the cabin, past Eli, into the cold, gray light. She did not look at Abernathy. She looked at the sheriff. He didn't take me, she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the terror she felt. I ran. He saved my life. Abernathy laughed. A likely story. The woman is clearly confused, addled by this backwoods ruffian. Her word means nothing. The utter dismissal, the casual erasure of her as a person, sent a hot flash of rage through Clara. But before she could speak, a new idea, terrible and absolute, formed in her mind. There was one way to end this. One way to save Eli. It was the only card she had left to play. She took another step forward, her gaze still fixed on Beasley, but her words were for Abernathy. If you promise to leave this man alone, to ride away from here and never harm him, I will go with you. Abernathy's smug expression widened.
Well, now, it seems the lady has come to her senses.
No! The word was torn from Eli, a raw, ragged sound. He reached out and grabbed her hand, his grip like iron. He pulled her back behind him, placing his body between her and the men. She ain't going anywhere with you.
Eli, please,
she begged, trying to pull her hand free.
It's the only way. Let me do this.
I said no, he repeated, his knuckles white as he held her hand. He would not let her sacrifice herself. He would not let her trade her life for his. The sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels drew their attention down the trail. A small crowd was coming from Dry Rock. Miller, the mercantile owner, was there, along with a few ranch hands and a handful of women, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and stern judgment. They had come to watch the show. They fanned out behind the sheriff, a silent jury of whispers and stares. See? Abernathy said, his voice dripping with condescending satisfaction. The whole town has come to see justice done. Now, for the last time, Cutter, step aside. The crowd began to mutter amongst themselves. Clara could hear the words floating on the still air. It's his legal right. Woman is his property. Cutter always was a strange one. They were siding with the law, with the money, with the man in the fancy coat. They were sentencing her with their whispers. Just then, a new voice cut through the murmuring, sharp and clear as glass. Justice! You call this justice? You pack of gossiping fools? An old woman pushed her way to the front of the crowd. It was Mrs. Gable, a widow who lived on a small plot of land at the edge of town. She was a woman known for her sharp tongue and her even sharper mind, and she was afraid of no one. She fixed her stern gaze on Abernathy. I may be old, Mr. Abernathy, but I'm not blind, she declared, her voice ringing with authority.
I saw that young woman in town the other day. I saw the fear in her eyes, and I see the look on your face now. You're a bully and a coward, accustomed to buying your way out of your own wickedness. This isn't about a wife. This is about a purchase you made that had the nerve to walk away."
She then turned her withering gaze on the sheriff. "And you, John Beasley, I knew your father. He was a man of principle. He'd be ashamed to see you hiding behind a piece of paper, ready to hand this girl over to a monster because he promises to build a new hotel." Abernathy's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You will hold your tongue, old woman, or I'll—" "You'll what?" she shot back.
"Have me arrested? I've lived in this territory for 50 years. I've earned the right to speak my mind."
She looked at Eli, and then at Clara, and her expression softened.
"That man,"
she said, pointing a bony finger at Eli,
"has done what none of you were brave enough to do. He offered a person shelter. He is standing up for what is right, not just what is written on a piece of paper."
Her words fell into a stunned silence. She had shamed them. She had spoken the truth that they had all been too cowardly to admit, but it was not enough to change the law. Eli knew it. He looked at the sheriff's determined face, at Abernathy's smoldering rage. At the guns in the hands of the hired men, he was out of options. There was no legal path, no appeal to reason that would save them. There was only one currency left that men like Abernathy understood. He let go of Clara's hand and took a slow step forward. "This ain't about the law," he said, his voice calm and steady, drawing the attention of every person there. He looked directly at Abernathy. "And it ain't about property. This is between you and me." He unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the dust with a soft thud. "But you're a coward hiding behind your money and your hired guns. So I'll make you a deal. Just you and me, one shot. If you win, you can take her. If I win, you ride out of this valley and you never come back." A gasp went through the crowd. Clara's heart stopped. A duel. He was offering his life. Abernathy stared, momentarily speechless. Then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He was an arrogant man, and Eli had just challenged his manhood in front of the entire town. To refuse would be to prove Mrs. Gable right. Besides, he fancied himself a gentleman, and gentlemen in stories settled matters this way. He glanced at his hired men, who nodded subtly. He looked at Eli, a lone man with no one to back him. The odds were in his favor. "You're a fool, Cutter," Abernathy sneered, swinging down from his horse. "But I accept your terms." He began to shrug out of his fine black coat. "Sheriff, you will bear witness. This will be a fair fight."
"Eli, no!"
Clara screamed, trying to run to him. But Mrs. Gable grabbed her arm, her grip surprisingly strong.
"You cannot,"
the old woman whispered fiercely.
"You must let him do this. It is the only way now."
The two men faced each other in the dusty clearing in front of the cabin, a space of about 20 paces between them. The townspeople formed a wide, silent circle around them. Sheriff Beasley stood to one side, his face grim, his hand resting on his own pistol. "I will count to 3, Beasley announced, his voice strained. "On 3, you may draw and fire. Is that understood?" Both men nodded. Clara watched in a state of suspended horror. The world seemed to fade to a dull roar in her ears. The only thing she could see was Eli. He stood tall and straight, his feet planted firmly in the dirt, his body perfectly still. He was not looking at Abernathy. He was looking at her. His pale eyes found hers across the clearing, and in them, she saw no fear, only a calm, sad resolve. It was his final, silent message to her. Whatever happened, he was doing this for her. "One!" Beasley called out, his voice echoing in the unnerving silence. Abernathy's hand hovered over the butt of his fancy, pearl-handled revolver. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He was a man playing a part. 2. Eli's hands were loose at his sides. He was as still as a statue, a part of the landscape, as patient and as dangerous as the land itself.
3.
Abernathy drew first. His hand was a blur, snatching the revolver from its holster. It was a fast draw, but it was born of panic, of a desperate need to prove himself. He fired wildly, the shot kicking up a cloud of dust 5 feet to Eli's left. Eli's draw was slower. It was not a trick of speed, but a single, fluid motion, economical and sure. He did not fire in haste. His gun came up, steady and level. The crowd heard the sharp crack of his Colt a split second after Abernathy's shot. It was a single, deliberate retort. Clara saw Abernathy jerk, his body flung backward as if punched. He cried out, a high, strangled sound, and clutched at his right shoulder, his pistol falling from his suddenly useless hand. He staggered and fell to one knee, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the fabric of his white shirt. Eli had not aimed for his heart. He had aimed for his gun arm. He had disarmed him, defeated him, shamed him, without killing him. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Abernathy began to moan, a pathetic whimpering sound. The fight was over. Sheriff Beasley drew his own weapon and strode toward Eli, his face set. "Cutter, you're under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." But as he reached for Eli, a voice from the crowd called out. It was Miller, the mercantile owner. "Leave him be, Sheriff!" Another voice joined in, one of the ranch hands. "He challenged him fair and square." "Abernathy drew first," someone else shouted. Suddenly, the town, which had been so quick to condemn, found its voice. They had seen the truth of it. They had seen a coward with a legal paper try to bully a good man. And they had seen the good man refuse to be broken. They had seen honor, and they had seen shame. He protected her when no one else would. "Mrs. Gable said, her voice cutting through the rest, clear and final. The sheriff stopped, looking from Eli's calm face to the murmuring crowd, and then to the whimpering, defeated man on the ground. He was a man who understood which way the wind was blowing. The town had made its decision. Clara felt Mrs. Gable's hand fall away from her arm. She was moving before she even realized it. She walked across the dusty clearing, her steps steady, her gaze fixed on the man kneeling in the dirt. She did not look at the blood. She looked at his face, contorted now with pain and humiliation. She walked until she was standing right in front of him, looking down on the man who had bought her, who had tried to break her, who had almost cost Eli his life. She did not say a word. She gathered the saliva in her mouth, and with a cold, deliberate fury, she spat at his feet. Abernathy looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and outrage. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was a declaration, loud enough for every person there to hear. "I would rather hang than belong to you." Then she turned her back on him and walked to Eli. He stood where he was, watching her, his face unreadable. She went to him and placed her trembling hands on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her palms. He was alive. He was safe. Sheriff Beasley holstered his pistol with a sigh of resignation. He walked over to Abernathy's men, who were helping their employer to his feet. "Get him on his horse and get out of here," he said, his voice weary. "And don't come back." He watched them ride away, a sorry, defeated procession. Then he looked at Eli and Clara, standing together in the middle of the clearing. He simply shook his head, turned, and led the townspeople back toward Dry Rock, leaving the two of them alone in the sudden, quiet aftermath. That night, they returned to the cabin. The air was still thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. They were both shaken, their bodies trembling with the delayed shock of what had happened. But they were safe. They were together. The world had come for them, and they had not broken. They had stood their ground, and they had won. The ride back to the cabin was a journey through a landscape of ringing silence. The thunder of the confrontation, the shouts, and the single, decisive gunshot had been replaced by the soft thud of the horse's hooves and the gentle creak of saddle leather. They did not speak. There were no words for the abyss they had just crossed. Eli rode with his shoulders set, his gaze fixed on the familiar trail, but Clara, riding behind him, could feel the fine tremor in his body, the tightly coiled aftermath of a violence he had summoned only for her. She rested her cheek against the solid wall of his back, closing her eyes, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of his breathing. He was alive. The thought was a prayer, a mantra that beat in time with her own heart. He was alive. When they reached the cabin, the familiar log walls looked different. Before, it had been a shelter, a refuge from the world. Now, it was a fortress they had successfully defended. It was their ground, consecrated by their stand. Inside, the air was still and cool, but a new kind of warmth began to radiate from the very stones of the hearth. It was the warmth of a shared victory, of a fear faced down together. That evening, as they sat at the simple wooden table, a pot of stew simmering on the fire, a sound filled the small space that had never been there before, the soft, quiet sound of laughter. It was not a joke that started it, but a shared look, a sudden, overwhelming wave of relief that was too immense for words, and it escaped them both as a breathless, tearful laugh. In that moment, the cabin stopped being his shelter and became their home. In the days that followed, they began the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding, not just their lives, but their world. They were no longer living in the shadow of survival, waiting for the next threat. They were living for the future. Clara found her project in the earth itself, behind the cabin, in a patch of land that caught the morning sun. She decided to plant a garden. Eli turned the soil for her, his strong back bending to the task, breaking up the tough prairie sod. The work was hard, but she reveled in it. She knelt in the dirt, her hands sinking into the cool, dark earth, feeling a profound connection to the land that had once terrified her. This was not the manicured soil of a Pennsylvania garden box. This was wild, stubborn ground, and she was claiming it. She planted rows of beans, squash, and potatoes, practical things for the coming winter. But at the edge, she scattered a handful of wildflower seeds she had collected from the meadow, a small patch of useless, defiant beauty. She was planting roots, not just for the vegetables, but for herself. Eli, in turn, began his own project. One morning, he came back from a trip to town with a wagon loaded with fresh-cut pine lumber and a box of nails. "A man needs a proper bedroom," he said, his explanation simple and direct. "And a woman needs a bit more space than this." He began to build a new room onto the side of the cabin. The sounds of his saw and hammer became the new rhythm of their days. It was a song of construction, of permanence. He worked with a quiet, focused intensity, his movements precise, the walls rising straight and true. Clara would bring him water, and he would stop, wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, and give her a small, tired smile that made her heart ache with a fierce, protective love. This new room was more than just wood and nails. It was a testament, a physical manifestation of the space he was making for her in his life, a life he had once sworn to live alone. They were building a home, piece by piece, gesture by gesture. The life they were creating was quiet, simple, and entirely their own. It was a world away from the one Clara had left behind, a fact that was brought home to her with brutal clarity one afternoon when the circuit rider returned. This time, he brought a letter addressed to her, in her mother's familiar, spidery handwriting. She took it with a sense of weary obligation and sat on the porch step to read it. The letter was filled with her mother's usual anxious fretting, but the underlying message was clear. News of the confrontation in Dry Rock had traveled, twisted and embellished, all the way back east. Her family had heard of Abernathy's public humiliation and his subsequent departure from the territory. "The unpleasantness is now behind us," her mother wrote. "Your father and I feel it is now safe for you to return. The scandal of that man will fade, and we can put this unfortunate chapter to rest. Your dowry is, of course, gone, but your father believes that with time, a more suitable arrangement can be made." Clara read the letter twice, a cold, hard knot forming in her stomach. A more suitable arrangement. The dowry drama. They had learned nothing. They did not ask if she was safe, if she was happy. They did not ask about the man who had saved her life, who had nearly given his own for her. They saw only a failed transaction, a social embarrassment to be managed. They were calling her home not to the safety of their love, but to the prison of their expectations. They wanted their daughter back, the quiet, obedient commodity they had sold once before. She looked up from the letter, her gaze sweeping over the landscape. She saw the new room, half finished but already a promise. She saw her small garden, the green shoots of the beans pushing their way toward the sun. She heard the steady, comforting sound of Eli's hammer from the other side of the cabin. This was her home now. This was her life. The girl who had left Pennsylvania was gone. Without another thought, she stood up, walked into the cabin, and opened the door to the iron stove where a low fire burned to keep the chill off. She held the letter over the opening, and with a sense of profound and final release, she let it go. She watched as the flames licked at the edges of the paper, the ink of her mother's words curling and blackening before turning to gray, weightless ash. She was burning the last bridge to her old life, and she felt no sadness, only a fierce, clean freedom. Eli came in a few moments later, a question in his eyes. He had seen the writer. She simply looked at him and shook her head, and he understood. He did not ask what was in the letter. He did not have to. He just reached out and took her hand, and in his touch, she felt the solid, unshakable truth of her choice. The wedding was in late summer, when the days were long and golden and the air was sweet with the smell of sun-cured grass. There was no grand proposal, only a quiet moment one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and violet. He turned to her, his pale eyes soft in the fading light, and said, "I think a man and a woman who build a house together ought to put a proper name to it, if she's willing." She simply smiled, her heart full, and replied, "She is." They were married in the meadow, surrounded by the late-blooming wildflowers she loved. The circuit rider, a man named Henderson, who also served as a justice of the peace, officiated. Their only guests were Mrs. Gable, her back ramrod straight, her eyes shining with fierce pride, and a quiet, leathery ranch hand named Silas, an old friend of Eli's who had come down from the high country for the occasion. Clara wore the blue calico dress she had made, the one she had bought on that terrible day in town. Today, wearing it felt like an act of reclamation. It was no longer a symbol of judgment, but of her new life. Eli stood beside her, his hair neatly combed, dressed in a clean shirt, his usual guarded expression replaced by a look of open, vulnerable happiness. The vows they exchanged were not the formal words from a book, but simple, heartfelt promises spoken into the vast, quiet expanse of the prairie, witnessed only by the sky and the two souls who truly understood their journey. That night, they slept for the first time in the new room he had built. He had made a bed frame from pine, strong and sturdy, and she had sewn a mattress ticking and stuffed it with fresh, sweet straw. It was their bed, in their room, in their home. Their wedding night was a world away from that first raw, hesitant joining. Tonight was soft and slow and profoundly emotional. It was a celebration of the trust they had built, of the safety they had found in each other's arms. There were tears, but they were tears of joy, of a gratitude so immense it could only be expressed in a slow, reverent surrender to the love she had never believed she would find. It was a quiet, sacred promise, a final healing of the deepest wounds. The months passed, and their life together settled into a comfortable, easy rhythm. Autumn came, and they worked side by side to harvest the garden, filling the small root cellar Eli had dug with potatoes and squash for the winter. The first snows of winter fell, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white, and the cabin became their warm, snug haven. The storms came, as they always did on the high plains, blizzards that howled for days on end, but they faced them together, content and secure by the fire, the sound of the wind a mere reminder of the world they had shut out. He taught her how to track animals in the snow. She read to him from the book of poetry in the long, dark evenings. They learned the landscape of each other's souls, the quiet comforts, the old scars. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a rich and living thing, full of understanding, full of peace. One night, deep in the heart of that first winter, Clara awoke. A full moon was high in the sky, its pale light streaming through the window, painting the room in shades of silver and gray. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was still and silent. She turned her head and found Eli awake, lying on his side, watching her. He was not looking at her with desire, but with a quiet, wondering awe, his expression full of a tenderness that stole her breath. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he still could not quite believe. She reached out and laid her hand on his cheek, the rough stubble of his beard scratching softly against her palm. She looked into his pale eyes, silvered now by the moonlight, and she felt a wave of love for this quiet, decent man so powerful it felt like a physical force. The words came to her lips as a whisper, the same words she had spoken in fear and wonder all those months ago. But now they were a declaration, a summary of everything he was, everything they had become. "You're not like other men." He did not reply immediately. A slow, sad smile touched his lips as he leaned into her hand. He covered her hand with his own, his thumb stroking her skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, and his words were the missing piece of his own story, the key to the fortress he had kept locked for so long. "Because you didn't treat me like one." She understood then. She had not seen the silent, scarred cowboy, the myth, the archetype. She had seen him, the quiet man who mended chairs, who liked his coffee black, who had a deep, aching loneliness in his eyes. She had seen Eli, and in seeing him, she had given him a gift he never knew he needed, the freedom to be just a man. She leaned in and kissed him, a long, slow kiss, full of the quiet history that now belonged only to them. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and they held each other in the quiet, silvered darkness, listening to the sound of each other's breathing until the first pale light of dawn began to touch the horizon. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts with us in English.